Late one Friday night, the dim glow of neon lights flickered over a packed bar, where laughter and music blended into a steady hum. The place was alive, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and freshly poured beer. Among the bustling staff was Jake, a young bar attendant who had been working there for just a few months. He was quick on his feet, sharp with his words, and always ready with a smirk, especially when dealing with customers who rubbed him the wrong way. That night, an older man walked in, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and worn-out jeans. He carried himself with quiet confidence, but didn't stand out much among the crowd. He took a seat at the bar, watching the scene with an observant eye. When Jake finally made his way over, he barely spared the man a glance. "What'll it be?" Jake asked, wiping down the counter with a rag. The man smiled faintly. "Whiskey, neat." Jake sighed, already irritated. Something about the man's calm demeanor got under his skin. Maybe it was the way he looked around like he owned the place, or how he didn't seem to be in any hurry. With a casual shrug, Jake poured the drink and slid the glass across the counter without a word. A few minutes later, the man raised a hand, signaling for another. But instead of serving him right away, Jake deliberately turned his back, busying himself with other customers. He figured the guy could wait. After all, it wasn't like he was anyone important. Then, just as Jake finally strolled over with another drink, a voice cut through the noise. It was the manager, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "Jake," he hissed, grabbing him by the arm. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Jake frowned, glancing at the man again. But before he could answer, the manager leaned in and whispered the words that sent a cold chill down his spine. Everything changed in an instant. Jake felt his stomach drop. The manager's grip on his arm tightened as he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the music. "That's Mr. Bennett," he said, his breath uneven. "The owner." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. His smirk vanished. He turned slowly, looking at the man again, really looking this time. The calm expression, the sharp eyes scanning the room, the way people seemed to instinctively step aside when he moved, it all made sense now. This wasn't just another customer. This was the man who signed Jake's paychecks, the one who could fire him with a snap of his fingers. A cold sweat formed on the back of Jake's neck. He had ignored him. Worse, he had dismissed him. His mind raced through everything he had done in the last 10 minutes. The slow service, the attitude, the way he had barely made eye contact. What if Mr. Bennett thought he was disrespectful? What if this was his last night working here? Jake swallowed hard. He had to fix this. Taking a deep breath, he forced a smile and stepped forward. Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice coming out awkward and stiff. "Can I get you anything else?" The older man looked up at him, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, just letting the silence stretch between them. Then he picked up his glass, swirled the amber liquid inside, and took a slow sip. Jake felt like he was being studied, measured. Every second that passed made the tension tighten like a knot in his chest. Finally, Mr. Bennett set the glass down. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show any sign of anger. Instead, he simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that somehow made Jake even more uneasy. "You've been working here for a few months, haven't you?" Mr. Bennett asked, his tone casual. Jake nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Mr. Bennett tapped his fingers on the counter, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm but firm, "do you always treat customers like this?" Jake's throat went dry. He could feel the weight of Mr. Bennett's question pressing down on him. His mind scrambled for a response, one that wouldn't make things worse. "No, sir," he said quickly, forcing a nervous chuckle. I didn't realize who you were." Mr. Bennett raised an eyebrow, his fingers still tapping against the counter. "So, if I weren't the owner, you'd still treat me that way?" Jake opened his mouth, then shut it. There was no right answer here. He had messed up, and they both knew it. The silence that followed felt unbearable, stretching longer than it should have. Before Jake could say anything else, the manager cleared his throat, stepping forward hesitantly. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice carefully respectful, "Jake is one of our newer guys. He's still learning." Mr. Bennett turned his gaze to the manager, studying him for a moment before shifting his focus back to Jake. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Jake feel like he was being tested. "I see," Mr. Bennett said, finally breaking the silence. He picked up his glass again, taking another slow sip. "Well, it's always interesting to see how employees handle their customers. You can learn a lot from a first impression." Jake nodded, unsure if he should say something or just wait. His mind was spinning. What was Mr. Bennett thinking? Was he angry, amused, planning to fire him the second his shift ended? A group of customers suddenly walked up to the bar, laughing loudly as they waved for Jake's attention. His instincts kicked in, and he immediately turned to serve them, but he couldn't shake the feeling of Mr. Bennett's eyes still on him. Every move he made, every word he spoke, it all felt like part of some unspoken test. As he poured drinks and took orders, he caught glimpses of Mr. Bennett casually observing the bar, watching the staff, noting every detail. He wasn't just here for a drink. He was watching everything, evaluating. And Jake had no idea what that meant for him. Jake tried to focus, but his hands felt clumsier than usual as he poured drinks. The laughter of the customers around him seemed distant, drowned out by the nagging tension in his chest. Every time he glanced toward Mr. Bennett, the man was still there, sipping his whiskey, watching. The manager had retreated to the back, clearly wanting to stay out of whatever was happening. Other bartenders worked around Jake, unaware of the storm brewing right in front of him. To them, Mr. Bennett was just another customer. But to Jake, he was a ticking time bomb, and every second that passed felt like it could be the one that changed everything. Jake took a deep breath and forced himself to act normal. Maybe if he just finished his shift without making any more mistakes, this would all blow over. Maybe Mr. Bennett would finish his drink and leave. Maybe. "Hey, kid," Mr. Bennett's voice cut through his thoughts. Jake nearly dropped the glass he was holding. He turned, forcing a polite smile, but his pulse was racing. "Yes, sir." Mr. Bennett leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bar. His expression was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that told Jake this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "You ever work in a place like this before?" Mr. Bennett asked. Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. This is my first job at a bar." Mr. Bennett nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something. "I figured. You've got some natural talent, but you don't understand what really makes a place like this work, do you?" Jake swallowed. I try to do my best." Mr. Bennett smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of smile that made Jake feel like he was walking into a trap. "Your best, huh?" Mr. Bennett said, swirling his drink. "Tell me something, Jake. What do you think is the most important part of this job?" Jake felt his mind scrambling for the right answer. Was it speed? Accuracy? Keeping customers happy? He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension hanging between them. He had to get this right. And yet, something told him, no matter what he said, he wasn't ready for Mr. Bennett's response. Jake's mind raced. What was the right answer? His palms were damp as he gripped the counter, trying to read Mr. Bennett's expression. Keeping customers happy, he guessed, his voice uncertain. Mr. Bennett let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Not quite," he said, taking another sip of his drink. "Customers come and go. Some are easy, some are impossible to please. You'll never win trying to keep everyone happy." Jake's stomach tightened. He had no idea where this was going, but he could feel the weight of the conversation shifting. Mr. Bennett set his glass down with a quiet clink. "The most important part of this job," he continued, "is respect. How you treat people when you think they don't matter says everything about who you are." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He thought back to how he had ignored Mr. Bennett when he first walked in, how he had dismissed him without a second thought. He felt a rush of embarrassment and regret, but before he could say anything, Mr. Bennet leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You see, Jake," he said, his tone now edged with something unreadable, "I didn't just drop in for a drink tonight. I've been watching this place for weeks, deciding on a few changes." Jake's breath caught. "Changes?" Mr. Bennet nodded. "Big ones. And I needed to see how the staff really operates when they don't know I'm watching." Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. The way Mr. Bennet said it, it wasn't just about him. This was bigger. "Some people are staying," Mr. Bennet said, his fingers tapping the counter again. "And some, well, they won't be." Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. Was this it? Was he about to lose his job? He wanted to say something, to fix this. But before he could even form the words, Mr. Bennet glanced over his shoulder and signaled for the manager. Jake's stomach dropped. Whatever was about to happen next, it wasn't going to be good. The manager approached cautiously, his face pale with tension. Jake felt like the entire bar had suddenly grown quieter, as if everyone could sense something big was about to happen. Mr. Bennet leaned back in his seat, swirling a last bit of whiskey in his glass before looking up at the manager. "Close the bar early," Mr. Bennet said, his voice calm but firm. "I want a meeting with the staff." Jake's chest tightened. This was it. He braced himself for the worst, already imagining being told to pack his things and leave. The manager hesitated for only a second before nodding and rushing off to inform the rest of the staff. Minutes later, the music stopped, the last few customers were ushered out, and the doors were locked. The employees, a mix of bartenders, servers, and kitchen staff, all gathered near the bar, whispering nervously to one another. Jake stood stiffly among them, trying to steady his breathing. Mr. Bennet looked around at the group, his expression unreadable. "Most of you don't know me personally," he began, "but I know all of you. I've been watching how this bar runs when I'm not around, and I've seen enough to make some decisions." The air in the room was thick with tension. No one moved. Mr. Bennet's gaze landed on the manager. "You've done a decent job keeping things running, but you've let some bad habits slide," he said. "That ends now." The manager swallowed hard and nodded, his usual confidence suddenly gone. Then Mr. Bennet's eyes shifted to Jake. "And you," he said. Jake's heart nearly stopped. This was it. He was done. "I saw a kid with potential," Mr. Bennet continued, "but also someone who still has a lot to learn. The way you handled me tonight, that was a mistake, but mistakes don't always have to be the end." Jake blinked, barely processing the words. "You're not fired," Mr. Bennet said, "but starting tomorrow, you'll be training directly under me. You need to understand what it really takes to run a place like this." A wave of relief hit Jake, but before he could even react, Mr. Bennet gave him a pointed look. "And if you don't step up, then you will be out." The entire room was silent. Jake nodded quickly, his mind still reeling. Mr. Bennet stood, adjusting his sleeves. "Welcome to your real test, kid." And with that he walked out, leaving Jake standing there, knowing his life had just changed forever. Jake stood there, his heart still pounding in his chest as the weight of Mr. Bennet's words sank in. The bar was quiet now, the staff exchanging looks, some relieved, others just as shaken as he was. He had expected the worst, being fired on the spot, but instead, he was now facing something even more intimidating. He wasn't just keeping his job, he was being put under the direct watch of the owner himself. The manager exhaled and gave Jake a pat on the back, a mix of sympathy and amusement in his expression. "Well, kid," he said, shaking his head, "you just got a second chance. Don't waste it." Jake nodded, though his mind was still spinning. He had never imagined himself in this position. When he took this job, he thought it was just about serving drinks, keeping things moving, and maybe making some tips along the way. But tonight had shown him that it was much more than that. It wasn't just about speed or even keeping customers happy. It was about respect, attention to detail, and how you treat people, even when you don't think they matter. As he grabbed a rag and started wiping down the counter, he realized something else. Mr. Bennet had tested him, not just to punish him, but to see if he could handle more. He wasn't just some disposable bartender. He was someone Mr. Bennet thought was worth investing in. The rest of the staff began trickling out, murmuring about what had just happened, but Jake stayed behind a little longer, running through everything in his head. Tomorrow, he'd be walking into the bar with a whole new mindset. The job he thought he had figured out was about to become something entirely different. As he locked up for the night and stepped outside into the cool air, he took a deep breath. He had no idea what the next few weeks would bring, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. With that, he walked off into the night, ready to prove himself.